Good day, class. Welcome to this episode where we learn the basics of grid system using CSS, media queries, and Bootstrap. Bootstrap is an open source front-end framework or toolkit that helps us build responsive sites faster and more efficient through built-in CSS styles, grid systems, and components. You can find the documentation of the current version of Bootstrap by going to their official website at www.getbootstrap.com. For beginners, a library is a collection of functions written in a specific programming language. For example, jQuery is a JavaScript library written using plain vanilla JS. So if you have to use jQuery in your project, you might have to simply include a file containing all the pre-written JS code. On the other hand, a framework is a collection of libraries written in one or more programming languages organized together to achieve one common goal. So when we say Bootstrap is a front-end framework, it is because it includes pre-written HTML codes, CSS styles, and JS jQuery plugins. And our goal here is to build responsive websites faster. To use Bootstrap in our project, we hit the Get Started button on the home page of the official site at the most recent stable version, and simply copy this external CSS files link onto our HTML page. Let us construct our own grid system to start building our web page first, and then later let's talk about how Bootstrap implements their grid system. So let's start by making a container div which is going to act as a wrapper for all the elements that is going to go into this section. Inside this container section, I'm about to make another div that we are going to call a row to contain a row of data. Let me show you a layout that I'm currently working on. It's not complete, but to understand grids, this will do the job for us. In this layout, you can see that I have a grid system going on and there are 12 columns making this grid. You can see that this What We Teach section is made out of 2 rows. Each row contains 4 cards. There's one for UI UX design, one for web development, one for Android app development, and one for game development in the first row. And in this first row that we are talking about here, there are 4 boxes, each spanning about 3 columns, which accommodates our entire 12-column grid. A 12-column grid system is mostly the standard used everywhere, and Bootstrap also uses a 12-column grid system. So to develop this What We Do section, we make a container first. That container is this wrapper box, and within that container I have 2 rows of data. So let me make 2 divs to replicate those 2 rows in the layout. And then what I want? I have 4 cards here. They're all of the same size, taking 3 columns each. So let's go inside each of these rows and make 4 divs for each of these 4 boxes. And I'm going to give them a class name of column. Since the second row also has 4 columns, let's paste the same content inside the second row also. So to quickly recap, we have a container div that contains 2 rows, and each row contains 4 column divs. Let me quickly add an internal style sheet, which some of you might argue isn't the best of practices. But as I told before, we are only learning the basics now, and this is just for demonstration purposes. Now since these cards do not have any content inside yet, let's give them a width and height, just to see them on our output page. I'm going to call these cards by their class name, column, and say you're going to have a width of 200 pixels and a background color of yellow. I'll quickly open the folder where I saved the HTML file and double click it to open it on my browser. Still the boxes are not visible because the column has a width of 200 pixels, but it doesn't have a height yet. So let me give it the same height as well. Now you see that the boxes are all stacked one below the other, but we want them one after the other. So we give the boxes a float property to make them all float left one after the other. This might be an old technique, and though you see the first 4 boxes float left inside the first row, you also see the boxes that are in the second row floating immediately after the 4th box. Let me get rid of the second row entirely for a moment and focus only on the first row, which contains 4 boxes inside. Though all these 4 boxes take a width and height of 200 pixels each, you can see that their parent div, the row div, does not have any height, because all its children that has any height are now floating. The very oldest and the very worst way to fix this issue is by going to the end of the parent row div and adding a non-floating child that clears out the float effects of the previous children. But before I clear the floats, let me go to the browser and check where this empty div is. As discussed before, since all these 4 columns are floating and contribute nothing to the height of the parent, you can see the empty div being positioned on top here, without respecting the presence of the other 4 children. Now let me add a clear property to the last child and check the result back again. Now you'll see that the empty div is actually placed at the end of the other 4 children's height, even though they are floating. Since this is fixed now, let me go to the HTML and copy it 2 times to get the 2 rows. Since we copied the second row also along with that empty div, we are going to find that empty div at the end of the second row. Now looking back at my layout, I prefer the container to be at the center at all times. But in our code here, the container is aligned towards the left. So what I'll do is I'll add a margin 0 pixel auto to my container div to keep it at the center. But if I refresh my page, I'm still going to find the container at the left because the width of the container is set to 100% and it doesn't make any sense, right? Trying to make a full width container aligned to the center. It is already taking the full space. So I'm temporarily going to give a width of 800 pixels to my container, which is the sum of widths of all the columns or cards inside. See, none of this is good practice. None of this is also good practice. But as I said, we are only trying to understand the basics here. Let's give our browser a refresh. Now you see the container is at the center and it spans to a width of 800 pixels, which is the sum of widths of all its columns. Now the problem is, I don't have any margins in between my cards. So if I add a 20 pixel margin on both sides, that is for the left and right, not for the top and bottom, the resulting gutter space would add to 40 pixel space between them. As you can see here in my layout, between each sets of cards, I have only a small margin. So let me make the margins as only 10 pixels on each side, which will sum up to 20 pixel gutter space. Adding this gutter space is now going to make my layout completely messy. This is because the container was only 800 pixels and had only enough width to accommodate 4 cards of 200 pixels each. Now the added margin of 10 pixel on each side makes each card technically take a width of 220 pixels, making the sum of widths of all the children to be 880 pixels, knocking the last box out of its position to the next line in each row. So let's make the container itself to be exactly 880 pixels and refresh our page. We are good to go again. Since the rows do not have any margins in between them, they look pretty awkward here. So I'm going to add a top and bottom margin of 20 pixels to both the rows. So let me refresh again. It makes it look perfect. Now moving on to our next issue. When I resize this window, you can see a horizontal scroll bar appearing. We don't want this to be happening. This is because in a PC view, we have enough space for our container, as it is only 880 pixels. So as long as I shrink the browser up to 880 pixels, I face no trouble. I'm not going to see the horizontal scroll bar yet. But once I resize my browser below 880 pixels, the scroll bar is going to appear. So to fix this, we are going to add a CSS media query. Inside my CSS, I'm going to say @media, only targeting the screens, and what is the condition during which this CSS should take effect. For this example, I'm going to write for a minimum width of 880 pixels because we know that that is the breakpoint below which we face our issue. So I'm going to copy all these styles which I have here and simply paste it over here because these are the styles I want above 880 pixels. So how should it be in the mobile view then? That is below 880 pixels. In that case, I want the container to be 100%. And when it is in full width, margin 0 auto to center it doesn't make any sense. So let's move it to the breakpoint above 880 pixels. Let's say an iPhone 6, 7 or 8 plus user visits our website. He's basically seeing a zoomed out version of our PC view because there is something wrong with our meta viewport tag. Sorry if you have noticed this before and were confused. I think I accidentally pasted my code with the cursor there, replacing the original meta viewport tag. So correcting that, my media query starts working fine and the container is now 100% instead of 880 pixels in the mobile view. Since we have not changed the size of the cards in the mobile view, each card is fixed at a 200 pixel width and height, and there is plenty of white space to the side, as there is not enough space to float one more div there. So let's go to the columns CSS and match it to the width of its parent by giving it a 100% width as well. So now the card is going to take the full screen width along with the container. But we actually see it overflowing a bit more here. This is because in addition to 100% width, we see here that there is also a 10 pixel margin for the columns on both sides. So I'm going to move that margin out of the mobile view, as I only want it in the PC view above 880 pixels. And the float property also doesn't make any sense because all the columns are 100% in width at this breakpoint and they should appear one below the other. Let's go to the PC view and remove the background color and height properties from there as they are redundant and we are not changing these values in that breakpoint. It seems to be all perfect now, except there seems to be a small margin given to the body tag by default. So in my CSS, I'm going to use the universal selector to select all the tags in my page and remove their default margin and padding. So now if I refresh my screen, the body tags margin on the sides disappear. Still there is some kind of margin on top here. That is because we gave a top and bottom margin of 20 pixels to each of our rows previously. If that's fine for you, you can keep it. Otherwise, you can remove the margin from the rows in your mobile view and keep it only in your PC view. Or even better, you can remove it from the rows and give it to your cards. Now this may seem redundant because we just removed the margin of our body tag, but since this container is spanning edge to edge now, there is a chance that my text content will start at the edge of the screen, which I don't prefer. So I'm going to add a padding to the sides of the container. But always remember, padding adds to the width of the box. So now the container is beyond 100% wide. So I'll go into this universal selector and say, whenever I add a padding, I do not want the width of the box to extend beyond its box's border. So the container is now 100%, but we also have a nice padding on both sides. As I said before, you can add your vertical margins to the columns instead of rows. So I want the same 10 pixel top and bottom margin to be carried forward to the PC view also. But I also want to keep the left and right margins of 10 pixels for the columns. As in the PC view, they will be floating one after the other horizontally. And that makes it perfect. The cards now have a tiny gap between them in the mobile view. Let's see if everything is alright in the PC view above 880 pixels. Oh, we see this last mischievous box jumping out of its row again. The reason for it is our container has a 15 pixel padding now on the sides for the mobile view, which is carrying forward to the PC view as well. So it's not 880 pixels now, but 880 pixels minus 15 pixels and 15 pixels because of the border box sizing. So I'm going to remove the padding for the PC view, and if I refresh, everything is back to normal again. The padding now applies only to the mobile view, not the PC view. Let's move on to the next step now and enlarge this browser to a maximum and see what happens. Our container is still taking only a maximum of 880 pixels, leaving a lot of white space on either sides. So if you're not happy with this, let's write one more media query to make a better grid. So let's keep this 880 pixel breakpoint for tablets and keep some other breakpoint for the PC. Let's say 1200 pixels. So when the width of your display is more than 1200 pixels, let's ask the container to take a width of 1080 pixel instead of 880 pixels. This margin and padding property here is going to carry forward to the PC view unless I change it here. So I'm going to remove those redundant properties. So to quickly recap, in the mobile view, I'm asking my container to take the full width, and for the tablet view between 880 pixels and 1200 pixels, I'm asking the container to take a width of 880 pixels, and for the PC view above 1200 pixels, I'm asking the container to take a width of 1080 pixels. So if I don't make any change to the width of the columns, I will notice that the columns occupy only 880 pixels of the available 1080 pixels width. To recalculate the width of the columns now, let's make some simple math. There are 4 columns and there are 3 gutters, 1, 2 and 3. Together they contribute to 1080 pixels of the container. Though this may seem correct, our gutter count is not actually 3, as the margins are split on both sides of the columns as left and right margin for all the 4 columns. Therefore that makes 8 margins instead of 3, right? We know the gutter value what we have. We gave a margin of 10 pixels on either sides. Therefore substituting 10 for G, we get 4C plus 80 is equal to 1080, which makes 4C is equal to 1000, which in turn makes one column width to be equal to 1000 by 4, which is equal to 250 pixels. So let's substitute that value for the width of the column in this breakpoint now. Checking it one last time, above 1200 pixels, we have our PC view. Between 880 and 1200 pixels, we have our tablet view, where the container is 880 pixels in width. And below 880 pixels, we have our mobile view, where the container takes the full width available. Perfect. Now that we have completed our own grid system, let us understand what Bootstrap does better for us. Bootstrap gives us a standard container with all the widths predefined for each breakpoint. It is going to give us a row, it is going to give us many different standard columns, each spanning across a width of 1, 2, 3 and so on up to 12 grid columns. It is also going to give us some standard breakpoints. Now I've been telling from the beginning of this video that we have used some poor practices like giving a fixed pixel width to our columns. So let's improve on it and change the pixel values to percentage. I know there are 4 columns on each of my rows. So instead of 200 pixels, I'll say each of my columns to take roughly 25% width of their parent. Then we know only the sum of the widths will be 100%, but the margins again will be extra and it will again push the last box out of the row. A quick fix to this would be to modify the width value to be not actually 25%, but reduce the 20 pixel gutter from it. But this calc function is going to cause some browser incompatibilities. Internet Explorer, we are looking at you. By the way, Microsoft has finally decided to stop shipping or supporting their Internet Explorer browsers moving forward. So that's good news for all of us. The other solution for this would be to keep the width at 25% and replace the margin as padding. As we have already given a border box sizing property, it should not extend the width of the column more than 25%. And we now no longer need the width specified in each breakpoint, as the percentage value is going to graciously resize our columns based on its parent. When you take a look at the output, the columns are only 25%. But since we gave a padding instead of a margin, the yellow color background is now applied to the padding as well. To show you the difference, let me add some text inside each of these columns and you will see that the padding is there. So to distinguish between the cards, instead of giving a color to the column itself, let's make one more div inside the column which sits inside the padding space, and let's give that a class name of card or content. And give the background color to that div. Now I see the gutter space in between those 4 columns. So this is one improvement we made to our code. Now to make another improvement, you can remove the empty div at the end of each row and give an after pseudo selector to the row or pretty much every element and clear the floats inside it. But an even better way is to remove the floats altogether and we can use a flex for the parent that originally contained these floating elements. So it's going to be the row div that has a display flex applied. Checking our output, you see that our row has a flex now and the output is pretty much the same, even though the floats are now removed. But let's go to the mobile view and see what happens there. See that? So to solve this, one solution would be to remove the display flex property in the mobile view. Give me 1 second, because we will remove this static height of 200 pixels, which is also a bad practice. It is always better to let the height be auto, so that a div always takes its contents height. Instead of removing the display flex property in the mobile view, there is also one more thing we can do. We can add a property called flex wrap to the row. When this property is set to wrap, the content goes one below the other. And when it is set to no wrap, it lays them one after the other. So let me add this flex wrap of wrap property to my rows CSS. You'll see when the columns take 25% width each, and when there is enough space for all of them to coexist in the same row, they do. But in the mobile view, when they are all set to 100% width each, they do not have sufficient space to exist in the same row. So they start wrapping one below the other. Now, why do we need Bootstrap if we can do all that by ourselves? Instead of writing all this code by ourselves, we attach an external style sheet that we get from the getting started page of getbootstrap.com, and voila, that's all we need to do. All these CSS are pre-written for us. Now we have some JS also to be linked, which is given in this documentation. So if you go through this, they are adding jQuery in the first line, and then they are using a JS library called popper.js that allows you to create some tooltips. Now if you are not going to use this functionality, you are good to skip this file. And the final script is Bootstrap's own JS file, which includes the code for the functionality of all the components they give us, such as the drop-down menu in the navbar, hamburger menus in the mobile view, tabs, carousels, etc. So to have them working, you definitely have to have this script file. Now there is a small problem with our code here. We've used a class name called column, which is not going to be recognized as this is not a pre-written style in Bootstrap. This is one of the drawbacks of using Bootstrap. Since we are including someone else's CSS, we have to stick to the class names that they have defined. For that reason, I'll have to stick with some column name that they have predefined. Let me change all these column names to colmd3. Now refreshing, everything is back into its place. So what does this colmd3 stand for? You know, col is short form for column. And if you see our layout here, each card takes 3 columns. We know that there are 4 cards and 12 columns in our grid. So each card spans to 3 column width, which is what this 3 means here. So if you go and inspect our code now, you'll see that they have also applied a display flex property to the row and a flex wrap of wrap property, which also we discussed earlier. And when I inspect this column md3 class, this also has a shorthand flex property which has a value of 0, 0 and 25%. Let's talk about it in a few seconds, but take a look here. They have also given a width of 25%, like us. Let's toggle that off and see what happens. Actually nothing. That's because this property is actually overpowering the max width property. So what is this flex property given here for? It's a shorthand property that combines 3 values: flex grow, flex shrink and flex basis. You can write them separately like this, or together in a shorthand way like how they wrote. Just like we write margin top, margin right, margin bottom and left individually or together. Let's discuss this flex grow and flex shrink properties in the next video using a separate demonstration. For now, we will talk about this flex basis property. So it's basically like saying you start with a width of 25% value. It's similar to our width property, but the only difference here is I'm saying start with a basic width of 25%, but if I give a flex grow value, you can grow beyond 25% as well. So it's like saying minimum width in this occasion. Also, when I give a flex shrink property, it can shrink below what is given in the flex basis value. So when we write these 3 properties together, it's like saying you start with a basic width of 25% and you can grow and shrink accordingly. But here, because I gave a 0, 0 value for the grow and shrink properties respectively, it's like saying you cannot grow or shrink. So that's basically the difference between what we had and what they used. We used a width of 25% they've used a flex basis of 25%. If this is column MD4 instead of 3, you see that the width has changed to 33.33%. That's because if one box takes 4 columns out of the 12 column grid system, it is going to occupy 1/3 of the available space. If you didn't understand that, take this as an explanation. 3 columns and 6 gutters, that is 2 on each side of the boxes, add up to give 100% width. We don't have to deal with the gutters here because we have replaced them with padding, which is now included in the column's width itself. So the 3 columns width is equal to 100% now. So 1 column width is 100% divided by 3, which is equal to 33.33%, which is exactly what they have given there. Similarly, column MD6 has a flex basis of 50% because there can be only 2 boxes of that width in a row. Finally, if I take column MD12, the flex basis would be 100%. That one box is going to take the entire column. Our final topic, what is that MD now? As I shrink this browser, keep an eye on this width now. It is going fine. It still has that flex going at a certain breakpoint, that is 767 pixels. You see that it wraps one below the other. So instead of MD, what if I give LG? Now MD stands for medium and LG stands for large. So what does this do? Now again keep a track of this viewport's width. I've gone beyond 768 pixels now and I'm still in this wrap mode. It's still wrapped one below the other. The situation is same up to 992 pixels, and beyond 992 it aligns one after the other. So basically what these MDs and LGs do is they decide at what breakpoint the content should wrap to go to the mobile view. So LG and MD are most probably the 2 breakpoints that we are going to use commonly. But we also have a XS, SM and XL breakpoint. To get their exact breakpoint value in pixels, let's go to their documentation and search for grid. And down here you have the breakpoints values. XS is below 576 pixels, SM is 576 to 768 pixels, MD is above 768 pixels, and so on. So if you want the layout to change to wrap mode, that is one below the other, below 1200 pixels, you may have to use column XL instead of LG. So that is your basics for CSS grid system and Bootstrap grid systems. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next video.